and welcome to my channel. My name is Billy, and in this video I'm going to be doing a wrap-up of sorts of all the books I read in April. I say a wrap-up of sorts because, if I'm honest, this wasn't a great reading month for me. I read 4 books, but 3 were extremely short and were read in probably the first week and a half of the month, and then I read one other book for the month, like completed one. So I'll go into the 4 books I read, and then I did like start a few books. I don't know. This month has been like really sporadic. I don't know if this has ever happened to you guys, but just like my reading has been sporadic where I would pick up a book, I would read maybe 100 pages, and then I don't know, I just would fall out of interest for a moment, and then I'd pick up another book, and then I'd read a few hundred pages, maybe 100 pages in that book. And I'm typically a person who reads one book at a time. So yeah, with the books I started and stopped, I could have probably completed one of them. So I'll share those with you as well. But to start off, like I said, I'll start with the books that I did complete. And the first book I read was The House of Dyes Dreer by Virginia Hamilton. This is a young adult book about a Black family that moves into a house that used to be part of the Underground Railroad and is suspected of being haunted. And it's told from the perspective of the 13-year-old son. And this was a really, really fun book. I actually read this as part of my Feeding My Inner Child series, where I'm rereading books that I loved when I was younger. And I talk about this more in that video, but I did really, really enjoy it. And I also read the sequel to that book. For this one, the sequel I read for the first time because I didn't actually know there was a sequel to it, and that was The Mystery of Juror's House. And I also did enjoy that book as well. I think that they were very, very wholesome, and I just loved the devices that, Virginia Hamilton uses to kind of keep the reader engaged. And yeah, I really did enjoy them. And then the third book I read was Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt, I believe. And I read all of these books on my Kindle, on my e-reader. So for Tuck Everlasting, that's also part of the Feeding My Inner Child series that I'm doing. For me, this one didn't age as well. There were definitely things that I feel like I picked up on as an adult that I kind of just like didn't think about when I was younger. I think I read this book for the first time in like the 5th or 6th grade. And for me, so for those of you who don't know, Tuck Everlasting, it's about this 10-year-old girl who runs away from home, or seemingly runs away from home, and she runs into this boy in the forest who is drinking from this spring. And this spring, unbeknownst to her, gives you like immortality, and his whole family has drank from this spring. And so to stop her from drinking from it, they like kidnap her to try to explain their story to her, and different events unfold from there. And she's like kind of infatuated with the boy in the family, the young son in the family. Yeah, that's the basic premise of the story. A few things bothered me. One, she's 10 years old and he is 17 years old, and somehow there's just this immediate infatuation where he is saying like, when you turn 17, you should drink from this spring and then we can be together forever. And they've only known each other like less than 24 hours. So that bothered me. The fact that she's 10 and he's 17, like, why are you even attracted to her in that way? I don't know. And also, like, it's 2 sons. There's an older son who's in his, I think, mid-20s, or that's when he stopped aging. And so I don't know, he just seems more stable to me, where the younger 17-year-old son is very like wild and unreliable. And I'm just like, why are you attracted to that? So I think I definitely read this a little bit differently being older, but I still think it was a fun read. And I did look up a little bit about the book, and I know it was written or inspired by the author's daughter, who had a nightmare and was afraid. She was saying like she didn't want to die. And so knowing that she wrote this story based off of that premise, and in the book you definitely see a lot about just like the circle of life and just the process of living beings and different things. So I can appreciate it from that standpoint, but there were definitely things where they didn't age well for me. Like as an adult reading it, I was just like, I don't know. But I read it in like a day though, so I thought it was very well written, and I thought it was, it's a good book. The fourth book I read, I actually have a physical copy, and that is The Jane Austen Remedy by Ruth Wilson. This is a memoir about a woman, or it's described as a memoir about a woman in her 60s who leaves her husband, leaves her life, moves into a house on her own, and rereads Jane Austen books to kind of rediscover herself, um, regain her identity, because she realizes on her 60th birthday that she's like unhappy with her life. And so that is the description of this book. First, I will say, if you are a Jane Austen fan, you will love this book. She gives many, many references to Jane Austen's books. The thing I didn't like about this book was, for it to be a memoir, I didn't feel I got enough about Ruth. And that was my biggest pet peeve with it. I haven't read any Jane Austen books. I am very interested, especially after reading this, to read some of them so I can better understand the references that she's making. But I didn't feel like she went in enough on her life. So that was my biggest thing with this, because if you're saying like at 60 years old, you left your husband and you're going to live on your own, and it does say like in her little bio in the back of the book that she and her husband are a married couple who live apart together. Like that's a big thing, like, or it's not like a typical thing. So I want to know more about that. Like, how did you guys come to that? And she does explain like a little bit, like they eventually get to the point where they are living in the same like building, and but they live in different apartments, and they have dinner together every day, and that kind of works for them. But I just want to know the emotion behind that. Like, how are you handling that emotionally? How is your husband handling that? What was his initial reaction? Like, there's just so many questions that go unanswered. And yeah, so I don't think this did it for me as a memoir, but I will say it seemed more like a study into Jane Austen's books, and how each time you read them, you can gain something different from them, from, if you read them when you were younger and then when you're older, or even just each time you reread them. So I definitely was intrigued by this, to read a Jane Austen book. I own Pride and Prejudice, I just haven't read it yet. And so yeah, that's what I'll say about this. If you like Jane Austen, you'll like it. If you want a memoir, I wouldn't suggest this as much. But I do appreciate this. This was a gift from my coworker, who, when I told her I hadn't read any Jane Austen books, she gifted me this, and it definitely piqued my interest in Jane Austen. So yeah, that was the fourth book I read. And then I have a few books that I like started and stopped that I plan on hopefully completing in May. And then I have a few that I plan for May. So this part of the video is going to be, I guess, kind of like a May TBR, even though I don't really do TBRs. I just pick out like 4 or 5 books that I think I want to read that month. So one book I started and stopped was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I'm about 128 pages in. This book is about a girl named Francie, and she's growing up in like the 1920s in Brooklyn, New York, and it's just about her life, and it's like a coming of age story. And so I'm enjoying it thus far. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. I don't know, it just, at times I don't feel into reading it. It could just be like the time. I don't think it's the book. But I am enjoying this. You have her her father who is a drunk, and then her mother, and you have her aunt who is kind of a scandalous, like, woman for the time and has different men. And it just goes into like Francie's life, the life of her mother and father, and it's just a good family story. I'm enjoying it, and this is a classic. So the other book I started and didn't complete was I'm Eve. This is another memoir or biography. It is by Chris Costner Sizemore, who is a woman with was a woman with multiple personalities, and she's actually the person who the movie The Three Faces of Eve was based off of. And in this book, we're getting the story of her life, and it's written by her. And in the beginning, it says it was used as like therapy to kind of figure out her condition. And I was really intrigued by this. For this one, I'm about 148 pages in, and I am enjoying it. I was really intrigued by this one though, because I have read Sybil, which is another book about a woman with multiple personalities. But that book, I believe, is written by a journalist, I believe. It's either by a journalist or her doctor or psychiatrist, and it's kind of talking about her life and her experiences with multiple personalities, but it's not written by her herself. And so this was really intriguing because I was like, it's written by the woman who actually has multiple personalities. And I can't help but think about that book while I'm reading this one. And I think the most interesting thing thus far has been that in the book Sybil, if you've read it, you know that she has had some pretty traumatic things happen to her personally that kind of leads to her developing these multiple personalities and dissociating. Whereas in I'm Eve, in her case, she doesn't necessarily have really traumatic things happen to her. She does observe kind of some traumatic things at a young age, but for her, it's really just like it's really like she can't regulate emotions, and whenever she has like an uncomfortable emotion, she will like dissociate from herself. And it could be like scared, fear, sadness, jealousy. She might just like dissociate. I think the other difference is in Sybil, like Sybil literally blacks out and doesn't remember anything. Whereas in this, it's like she is seeing things happen, but she doesn't, it's like she's seeing someone else do them, and she doesn't realize it's her as that person doing them. So this is a really intriguing book. I'm really enjoying it thus far. So I do plan on continuing these into the month of May. And then two other books I have from the library that I would like to read this month are Answered Prayers by Truman Capote. This will be my second Capote read. The first was Breakfast at Tiffany's, which I thought was well written, but having seen the movie, I wasn't a big fan of, and I think it was definitely because of the movie. I went in with different expectations, but I was really interested in reading this because I've heard, and both of the books I'm going to mention were actually inspired by Lex Reads on her channel, because she mentioned these two books, and I was like, oh, this sounds so good. But basically, I know nothing about this book except for the fact that after he wrote this, a lot of people shunned him because they felt like he was putting their personal business out there, even though he didn't use their name directly. They were like, you're talking about me. And so I was really interested in reading this because I wanted to read this. And then one of you guys had actually recommended, I believe the book is called Swan Song. And I felt like reading this, maybe I'd have a better appreciation for that book, because I know that Capote would call his friends like swans. And then I think that book goes more into like the falling out of him and his friends. But I felt like I would understand more of why that happened if I read this one. So this is one book I would like to read in May. And then the last book I want to try and read in May is D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. This book is about a woman who marries a man who, I believe he's at war, and he becomes paralyzed from the waist down. And it's about her like dealing with that and her sexual desires and escapades, and how she deals with that as being married to this person who can no longer fulfill those things for her. So I believe this was very like risque for its time. It was published originally in 1928, I believe. That's what this edition says. So I'm very intrigued to see what was said. I feel like nowadays this probably be pretty tame, but I do like the older writing styles, like of like the Victorian era, like those older books, because I feel like they just say the most like scandalous or like shady things, but they say it in such a beautiful way that it's like it's just very funny to me usually. So I'm very much looking forward to reading this. So that's kind of been my reading month, and those are kind of my plans for May. I did get a bunch of books for, well, not a bunch, but a few books for my birthday. So I'm planning on sharing those with you in another video about the new books that I picked up. And I will, I guess I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.